Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. I'm Anna Kate, and I'm joined today by William A. Ross, who is the Associate Professor of Old Testament and Director of the Doctor of Ministry program at the Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he's also the author of Ruth as part of our Baylor Handbook on the Septuagint series. And we are so excited to have him on today to talk about his new book. Welcome, Will.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So this is part of our series. We have the Baylor Handbook on the Hebrew Bible. We have the Baylor Handbook on the Greek text, and then this one is the Septuagint. And so it's just kind of exciting to get to dive into Ruth, not the MT, but the LXX, and get to look at some of the features of that. And so in your preface, you talk about how your participation in producing a detailed textual and grammatical commentary on a Greek text is a grand and ancient philological tradition. So talk to us a little bit about how you first became interested in philology and why this project was so important to you.
Yeah, great question. I think I teach biblical languages here at RTS, and a lot of times I find that my students will say something like, "Oh, Dr. Ross, you're a linguist," and in some ways that's true. But for the most part, I think it's more accurate to say that what we do as we handle the ancient texts of Scripture and the ancient language is something closer to what used to be called philology, which is an older word. And most sort of normal people, when you say that word, will say, "Come again, did you mean philosophy? What did you say?" But philology is just the study of ancient texts and languages, and it is
Yeah.
pre-linguistic in the sense that it's not necessarily theoretically informed by modern linguistics, but it is part of a very ancient way of studying texts, especially associated with the Reformation and humanism and the ad fontes mindset to discover and edit ancient texts. But it is even more ancient than that. That's just early modern. This approach to particularly Greek texts really goes back to the Greeks themselves in the Hellenistic era and Alexandria, which is often considered the place where the Septuagint may have originated. And so I thought it was an exciting opportunity to comment and handle the grammar and language of the Septuagint by drawing on a lot of the grammatical tradition that goes all the way back to the Library of Alexandria itself.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a rich tradition. And so it's more than maybe just interpreting or translating or developing a grammar on Septuagint Ruth, but it's engaging in this ancient practice of understanding and uncovering ancient texts. And so it really is just, I think it's a fun endeavor and so cool that you got to work on this project.
It's a task that involves very close attention to details, and you're looking at grammar and syntax and lexicon. You're consulting other ancient texts to see how particular words or phrases were used in the similar time period by the similar types of people, and you're comparing various manuscripts of the same book. This is one of the issues for the Book of Ruth, is there's text critical issues involved, and so you're trying to establish the text, you're trying to interpret the text, and you're trying to translate it, and it's a lot of levels. And this is the basic task, of course, of biblical exegesis that your average seminary student will know all too well.
Right.
But we don't think about it oftentimes as philology, but that's what it is.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Well, so let's go ahead and get into the text. So I want to start in Ruth 1, the very first word. And so it was. In the Hebrew, you have the sequential verb. But you say that these words establish the trajectory of the entire narrative arc, which is centered on the various problems associated with childlessness, while leaving entirely unclear to a first time reader, at least, whether the story is to be a comedy or a tragedy, which is so, I just loved that sentence. I thought it was so interesting. So, how does the language employed here, just even in introducing the narrative, help a first time reader uncover the genre?
Yeah, so lots to say here potentially, but of course, um, the way the book begins in Greek and in Hebrew is you're, as a reader, just dropped right into the middle of something that feels like it's already happening, right? So this idea of in medias res, right? You're so sort of dropped into unfolding action. And so it was, right? And it feels like, in the way the language operates there, in Greek, it's kaiageneta, in Hebrew, vayahi, which are discourse markers that help frame and move along a narrative just at the beginning of a story. So it primes you as a reader to conceptualize the story you're entering into within what you may already know about the story of Israel. And of course, there's sort of artificial, your imagined first time reader, but the first verse goes on to say, when the judges were in power. So you're automatically cued with a sort of conceptual world within the well-known history of Israel about when you are, where you are, the kinds of
Yeah.
conditions that are unfolding in Canaan. And those conditions are pretty grisly. They're pretty grim, right? There's
Mm,
war, there's conflict, there's famine. Israel's under the judgment of God. And so, as a reader, some of those things maybe are kind of in your, encyclopedic knowledge rattling around, and you get dropped into this narrative, and the judges are in power. There's a famine in the
mm.
land, and people are on the move. And you're just primed, right? Like, oh gosh, this could go very poorly. I'm not sure. And as the verses unfold here, just in the first chunk of the book, a whole stage is set where you have Naomi, of course, her husband, her sons traveling outside of Judah, out of the land into Moab. And that immediately there's just death. Everyone, almost everyone dies.
Yeah.
And so they're at risk. You have Naomi, her daughters in law, who are sort of dangling there socially, experientially, and the reader's left wondering, how is this going to turn out, right? Happy ending? Is it a comedy? Or sad ending? Is it a tragedy?
Mm.
And you don't know, but it happens very rapidly, and just a very highly economical handful of verses.
It does, you're right, and I was recently translating Ruth from the MT, and it is just interesting, like, it happens so fast, like you're saying, everybody dies, there's a famine in the land, like, it all is just in such quick succession, and I think you're right that it does kind of open the story up to where a reader can really only imagine, those 2 possible endings, either this is a tragedy, this is gonna end really poorly, or something's going to happen. And
Uh-huh.
so it does really start to paint that picture.
Yeah, and there's a lot of social elements involved as well. Obviously, women in the
Right.
ancient world were highly dependent on others for protection and sustenance. And you've
Yeah.
got the problem of childlessness, right? Which is also a
Right.
social problem, so to speak, for the sake
Mm,
of the lineage. And this gets us almost immediately into broader theological considerations, right? Again, as a reader who understands the story of Israel, something of the promises of God, right? Kings will come from Abraham, and this
yeah.
lineage issue, this promise of ongoing family lines. And here we have a story set up with the apparent destruction of a family line. So that kind of adds to the complexity of the story just from the very outset.
Right. Yeah, and there's also, along with that, some of these kind of contrasts, even just with the fact that they're leaving Bethlehem, the house of bread, because of a famine, a lack of bread,
Right.
right? And then kind of, hinting at the social aspects that you're pointing to as well, the fact that they're fleeing Bethlehem to become sojourners.
Mhm.
All resident aliens is sometimes a gloss there. And so, kind of like you're saying, it's painting this picture where there's sort of a reversal of
Mhm.
the expected norm.
That's right. That's right. And they're leaving the promised land, right? So what good can come
Right.
from that, right?
Yeah.
Going out of the house of
Exactly.
bread during famine, leaving the promised land, going to Moab, all
Yeah.
sorts of baggage with Moab. So there's lots of,
Right.
yeah, kind of broader, depending on how, as a sort of first time reader, even if you know almost nothing, you can see there's going to be problems. But at a
Right.
deeper level, richer level, more sort of biblical theological level, that, is only enhanced in a sense that you can see there's a lot of questions and problems that this story needs to resolve.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's get into the story. We'll move on to maybe the most famous passage in Ruth, which is Ruth's pledge to Naomi. It's on mugs, it's on wedding rings, it's on, everything and more. But you spend time on this phrase, hoti thanatos diastole.
Mhm.
Forgive my Greek pronunciation here.
You did great.
But talk to us a little bit about the verb and how its translation frames Ruth's view of the prospect of death.
Yeah, that's good. So again, death is kind of in the background thematically for the whole
Mm,
story, life or death, right? Family or childlessness. And so this is maybe, except for maybe the threshing floor scene, one of the sort of climaxes of the book is this pledge that Ruth makes. So this is Ruth 1:17, which in my Greek translation, I translate, and wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried.
mm,
And all this may the Lord do for me and grant it. And then here's the bit you were asking about, since it is death that will tear between me and you.
yeah,
So there's a few little grammatical differences here than what the Hebrew text in the Masoretic text has, which is usually translated something like, even more so, if anything but death parts me from you or separates me from
right.
you. Um, so a couple little kind of geeky things to say about this particular clause, which is the reason clause that Ruth provides, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so basically, thanatos diastele. So the verb here, diastello, is an interesting choice for the translator. So a lot of times I do Septuagint scholarship a lot, and a lot of times what we think about when we do that is linguistic choice, right? What sort of sense or resonance does a particular word have? How is it used in other sources? Why does the translator use it here? Uh,
Mm,
and this is an interesting choice because it's a word that usually has to do with a physical detachment, separating
yeah.
two things. And usually it's like a forceful separation. So
Right.
if you come to this clause with that sort of idea in mind, you get the sense that Ruth is basically saying, um, whatever separates me from you, Naomi, it's going to have to rip me apart from you. We're going to have to tear us
Yeah.
from one another. Um,
Right.
so it's I think a choice on the part of the translator that highlights Ruth's commitment, right? Her sincerity in her
Mm,
pledge to Naomi and Naomi's God. Another thing that's interesting about this little clause here is in Greek word order and information structure. This particular clause has a subject that is preposed. Okay, it comes
mm,
just before the verb, um,
yeah.
and this is called the cleft clause. All right, and so what it does is it places something new in the discourse in a focal
Mm,
position, right? And I tried to convey that with my translation. Instead of saying, death must separate me from you, the
mm,
translation is, it is death that must separate me from
Mm,
you. And that
yeah.
slight difference in phrasing at least attempts to reflect how the Greek grammar operates here. Um, so that's, kind of just some of the nitty-gritty details. But again, the idea here is she is emphatically highlighting her commitment to Naomi and Naomi's God and her decision to travel with her, which may be the point at the narrative where the reader says, okay, maybe this isn't going to be a tragedy, right? There's a sort of a glimmer of hope after all.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. And I think, if anything, the Greek translation, as you said, with the word order, but also just the inflection of the verb, it also is kind of um, in some ways standing in stark contrast to Orpah, who kind of willingly leaves, right? And
Mhm.
so, not to paint Orpah in a negative light, she does what her mother-in-law instructs her to do, which in some ways is an honorable thing. But it seems like the Greek is almost in this way further emphasizing Ruth's fidelity to her mother-in-law over and against Orpah's choice to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not it's a statement, right? Uh
Yeah,
Death will tear us apart, right? Not
yeah.
it might this may be how it goes. She's stating it clearly
Hmm.
and decisively.
Right. For sure. Let's move to Ruth 2:3, which you translate as, "And she went and collected in the field behind the harvesters, and she just so happened to stumble upon Boaz's portion of the field, the man from the family of Abimelech." And so you translate this word fate, and kind of the idea of stumbling upon Boaz's field, which in Hebrew is the mikrayah, and it's the perit paomati in Greek. And so, talk to us a little bit about this idea of fate and the fact that she kind of stumbles upon Boaz's field.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I love this. I love this little it's sort of a change or it's a textual variant. But okay, so again, you're at the point here in the story where Ruth and Naomi have come back to Bethlehem. Naomi knows of Boaz, right? And she knows he's powerful, that he's influential, he's well to do, this sort of thing. And she, uh, Ruth has made clear to Naomi that she's prepared to go and provide for them, right? So Naomi sends her out and says, go ahead and go do that. This is before Naomi tells her to go to the threshing floor. Okay, so she's just going out to glean and harvest and see what she can come up with. So this is 2:3 verses chapter 2 verse 3. And the way I translated this verse is she went and collected in the field behind the harvesters. And she just so happened to stumble upon Boaz's portion of the field. I think it's fascinating here. So there's a couple things to say. So basically, verse 3 has something that is almost a textual variant, um, right? So, and you're kind of alluding at that. The Hebrew there says something like, uh, "It." She went out and happened to come to, and the way it's vocalized in the Hebrew text, the word chance or accident or happenstance, you might say, is mikreha, and the word there has a third feminine singular suffix on it. It was Ruth's happenstance, if you will, her fate, her destiny. Okay. Now, the way that this is translated in the Septuagint here does not reflect that third feminine singular ending. And so
Yeah.
some have suggested that the translator sort of made a what you could call a theological change here by not rendering that
Hmm.
suffix. The translation lacks a sense of divine providence in this event.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of what we're reduced to in Septuagint scholarship is like trying to make theology or these minute little details into bigger points. I think that
Right.
that perspective maybe goes a little too far, because one of the things we have to remember as we're looking at the Septuagint translation is that the translators themselves are dealing with an unpointed Hebrew text. Okay, so
Yeah.
if you look at Mikreha and you take away the pointing, the consonants are the same. So it may
Yeah.
be instead that the translator is just reading this word, his reading tradition in his Jewish community in the ancient world is not a tradition that had a third feminine suffix in it. So it may not represent a change, a sort of a conscious change. It's a difference, right? It's more of a text critical difference, right?
Mm,
So it's a difference in reading tradition, but not theology. Okay. So, but it is still fascinating, right? The way this is put here. Uh, it just so happened, right? The idea that, Ruth, she's doing her best. She's going out to provide.
hmm.
She's pledged herself to Naomi.
Yeah.
And she goes out, and wouldn't you know it, the first field she happens to walk into is Boaz's. So it's an interesting plot development that
Yeah.
is not overtly um, described as a divinely appointed event, but I think you're sort of
Right.
invited, almost ironically, like wink, wink, like we know, kind of like God's involved here in the background. God knows what's
Right.
needed.
Yeah. And I think certainly in contrast to this next scene, the threshing floor scene, where Naomi specifically instructs Ruth on where to go and what to do. And Ruth responds by saying, I will do exactly what you tell me to do, exactly how you told me to do it. And so I think you're right that in some ways, even just that absence is pointing to the fact that, you can kind of infer as a reader that there's a divine hand in her happening upon that field. And it wasn't an instruction given her by any human actor or a will of her own volition
Hmm.
either.
Hmm. And I mean, it may also hint at the fact that, like Ruth she's a canny lady. She's shrewd, right? And
Yeah.
she sort of
Hmm.
understands their situation. And so if you're going to go glean in a field, you might as well go glean in a really nice big field that's owned by a nice
Yeah.
wealthy guy, right? So
Yeah.
it's I think it indicates something about her character as well.
For sure. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and get into the threshing floor scene. And I want to hone in here on verse 9, where you say, many commentators on the Hebrew text associate the meaning of this request with Boaz's commendation of Ruth in 2:12 for taking shelter under the protective wings of God, often citing Ezekiel 16:8 as intertextual support. Although this understanding may well be correct, it does not appear to reflect the interpretation of this verse by the translator of Greek Ruth. So you're kind of pointing to this idea, and really the contrast between an interpretation that is more of a promiscuous reading of the wings, and more of a theological divine protection reading of the wings. So talk to us about how you chose to translate this verse, and then the implications of a promiscuous versus a divine protection reading.
Yeah, this is good. I I teach a class on the historical books, and we always talk about this every time we get to Ruth. Um, so I've got ideas about the text in general, but I'm going to stick to the Greek version right now. Um,
Sure.
so basically, they're there, it's dark, right? And he says, "Who's there?" She says, "I'm Ruth, your
Hmm.
servant." And then she says, the way I translate the Greek here is, "You should put your fold over your servant,"
Mm,
referring to herself,
yep.
since you're a pledge relative. Um, okay, so the sort of word at issue here, potentially, in Greek at least, okay, because you might have to make a different kind of argument if you're looking at Hebrew only, is the
Right.
phrase top turgion su, which is your fold, place your fold
Mm,
over your servant. Okay. So when you're looking at the Hebrew side, it's very common, and I think correct in a certain way, that this comment of um, Boaz's his fold or his wing here in Hebrew, it's af, which is like a wing. It's like a sort of edge piece of something, prototypically
yeah.
like a bird's wing. And the same in Greek with pteurgion. And so commentators will say, okay, this comment here, whether it's deliberate on Ruth's part or it's just the way the author sort of constructed this scene here, seems to allude to Ezekiel 16:8. And
Mm,
Ezekiel 16:8, lots going on here. It's this discussion of Israel as a faithless bride. And it says, I passed over you, God speaking. Behold, you're at the age for love. I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your
mm,
nakedness, right? So it's like, well, there's a lot of thematic parallel right there. You've got this love scene,
yeah.
sort of male female imagery. There's the wing, there's the covering, there's nakedness, right? So there sure are a lot of, again, thematic parallels. And
Hmm.
I think it's fair and probably right to draw those connections at least a theological, biblical theological level.
Yeah.
Now, the question I try to get at here in my comment on this one little phrase, ta purgiansu, is that I'm not sure that the Greek translator was having those thoughts. At least
Mm,
the words that he chose here
yeah.
don't seem to reflect that the Greek translator, Ezekiel 16:8, in mind. And the reason I think he may not have is that when you go to Ezekiel 16:8 in the Septuagint, a similar
Mm,
word is used there, which is terux, which is also wing. But the word we have
yeah.
here is pterygion, which is like a diminutive form. It's like a little wing. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So if you're going to sort of allude to Ezekiel 16:8 as a translator, you
Yeah.
would expect you're going to use the same word.
Right.
Instead, he uses a word that shows it does show up other places. One of the words that shows up is Numbers 15:38.
Mm,
And that is part of the ceremonial law as Israel's instructed to have fringes on the fold of their
mm,
garments. Ta pturgia ton hemation auton. The same word there, referring
yeah.
to clothes. Okay, so
Mm,
essentially, I'm, this is a tentative argument, but I'm saying this may just be a part of his clothing. Um, and
yeah.
it's not necessarily meant to have overt theological overtones to Ezekiel,
Right.
but it's actually part of Boaz's robe.
Mm,
Now, one thing that's interesting about that, if I'm right, which I may not be, is that the Turgion part of a robe is actually the kind of garment that a Hellene would wear, a Greek. Uh, and
mm,
it's actually a translator, potentially, again, if I'm right, envisioning Boaz in what is actually a later Hellenistic type of male garment, this
yeah.
himation sort of wrap that would leave you
Hmm.
basically plenty of cloth to cover up someone else. um,
Right.
so again, I think it leaves open uh, to us as readers of the Greek text, sort of wondering, okay, what did Ruth have in mind? If she's just talking about, right, spread your coat over me,
Yeah.
it may or may not help us or hinder us from making conclusions about the promiscuity of of the text. But
Right.
I do think it's a comment about the cloak.
Right. For sure. Yeah. I think you argue this point well. And the way that you use what's exactly there in the Greek, just it made sense to me. And I think even reading to what you were saying that in Septuagint, Ezekiel, they're not using the same word. And so you would think they'd draw those conclusions. And it's funny. So I'm in seminary and we do four scriptures classes, two Old Testament and two New Testament. And both the Old Testament classes cover Ruth because, the one professor sees it at the beginning and one sees it on the second end. Um, and they both have different readings of Ruth. And so one of the professors reads Ruth as yeah, a promiscuous scene, and the other one sees it as a more theological or just a plain kind of to what you were describing, the Septuagint, just referring to his coat and his coat alone. And so it is interesting how um, we, as modern interpreters, are trying to read and understand that passage. And so were even the Alexandrian Greeks and other translators of the text, even,
That's right.
some of the earliest manuscripts.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's right. We all want to know
Yeah.
what happened.
Yeah. We do. We're all curious. So, well, let's move to chapter 4. And so here we have the legal matter. There's kind of this idea of a sandal and just some other things that are happening. And so, um, it's a little bit different in the Septuagint than the MT. This is another place where the text kind of diverges. And so, tell us about some of these key differences in the legal dealings that happen in chapter 4.
Yeah, it's an interesting passage here in Ruth 4 where Boaz goes to deal with the near redeemer. And
Yeah.
it kind of shifts you from this kind of romantic scene into like business, like
Yeah.
legal stuff. So it's a real
Right.
shift of tone, but it's fascinating because it involves some of these more overtly legal terms. And this
Right.
comes to attention for Hebrew Bible scholars and also for um, Septuagint scholars like me. So you've
Right.
got this phrase here in verse 4 where they strike this deal, right? And
Mhm.
they they do the sandal thing, okay? And the
Yeah.
narrator pauses the story to explain what on earth they're doing with the footwear, right? And so you get this
Yeah. Yeah.
comment in verse 7. This is the custom in the former times, right? It's like a background comment, right? Here's what they're doing,
Yeah.
guys. It's like parenthetical remark. This was the
Yeah.
custom in the former times concerning redeeming and exchanging, right? And so you have uh, this phrase here in Hebrew that's translated a particular way in Greek. So again, you've kind of shifted into this legal framework for what's going on, a contractual terminology. And what's fascinating is that the translator uses terminology in Greek that is very much part of and at home in Ptolemaic Egyptian contract language. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating from the perspective of someone like me because it tells us this translator um, has a particular social context himself that
Yeah.
he's familiar with this kind of language and he's putting it to use despite its slightly different sense or greater specificity than the kind of Hebrew contractual language. So there's the word here, dikaioma,
Mm.
and it's a it's a bear of a word itself. It's got all kinds of different interesting aspects and nuances, but one of the ways it's used, you see this especially in papyri and documents that we can find in Hellenistic Egypt, as a word for supporting document. Okay.
Mm.
And so he translate the phrase here, the way I've translated it. This was the guarantee earlier in Israel concerning the relative's pledge that the man would untie his sandal and so forth. So
Yeah.
that's the word there for guarantee, the dikaioma. It's the pledge. It's the supporting document, even though it's a sandal and not a
Right.
document. Uh,
Yes.
but this idea that the token, right? The translator is explaining this cultural transaction using legal terminology that his readers would have understood fairly well. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating it's like a shift of cultural frame more than a textual
Mm.
variant per se. That's maybe how I would
Right.
describe it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's pointing to the context of the translator himself. And so also it's kind of indicating not only an aside, you called it like a parenthetical comment from ancient Israel, similar to the introduction, like when the judges were judging, where it's like, this, from
Hmm.
Israel's
Right.
history. But it's also kind of placing the Septuagint translation within its own particular
Yeah.
context. And so it's almost like a parenthetical aside in two worlds, right?
That's right.
Both in ancient Israel and in Alexandrian Greece. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, and I think one of the most interesting things of what I do in Septuagint scholarship is looking at the text, the Septuagint translation itself, as a cultural artifact of Second Temple
Yeah.
Judaism. And in some ways,
Mm,
it's a commentary. There may be theological aspects to it at times, but there are also social and cultural aspects to, again, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, to the philology of the text. And
yeah.
exploring that it's a lot of fun.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I hope if you are listening or watching us online that you will purchase William A. Ross's Ruth, a Baylor Handbook of the Greek Text at baylorpress.com today. Will, thank you so much for joining us. This has just been such a fun conversation, and I hope people will get as much out of the book as I did. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope so too.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.